Welcome back. You're listening to the Law Show, and we are speaking with Michigan Supreme Court candidate Bridget McCormack. She is running for the Michigan Supreme Court in 2012. In fact, next Tuesday you're going to get a chance to vote for her, and she's here to tell us all about why she wants to run and what the Supreme Court is all about, and her background and things like that, just so you can get to know her a little bit and find out a little bit about her take on the Michigan Supreme Court. So welcome back, Bridget.
Thank you.
I appreciate you coming and talking to our listeners. It's always important. Every election we have, we try to do a little bit of something about the Michigan Supreme Court. Again, for listeners that are just tuning in, in fairness, we invited every single Supreme Court candidate onto the show at various times, and Justices Zara and Markman and Judge O'Brien, for some reason, declined to come on. And we're sorry about that, and we wish we could have gotten them on. We certainly could have, but they chose not to come. But what I wanted to ask you about now is tell our listeners, why does the Supreme Court matter to them? I mean, most of them are never going to go in front of the Supreme Court. Why does it matter? Say, for example, like in the Nestle case. Why would that matter?
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing. The court decides cases every term or every year, you might think about it in layperson's terms, that affect all of our families and communities in really important ways. The cases that make it to the court obviously matter to the parties that are there, but the Supreme Court only takes cases that have an impact on all of our families and communities. These are not cases that only affect the two parties before the court, or the court doesn't take it. That's the kind of case the court says no to. So every year, the court is deciding important cases that affect our environment, our families, our rights as patients, our rights as consumers, our civil rights, and making decisions about who has access to our justice system. I mean, just for one example, the court had the final word just recently on which issues are going to be on our ballot this fall that we're going to get to vote on. That was the Michigan Supreme Court that ultimately made that decision. There was a lot of fighting about it before it got there, but the Michigan Supreme Court has the last word. That's true with lots of other legislation that there's fighting about. The Michigan Supreme Court will have the last word about whether the legislation can stand if there's a constitutional challenge.
So, for example, our seniors who may be listening right now, the Supreme Court got the last word on whether or not their pensions were going to be taxed.
That's correct. The Supreme Court was the one that said, in fact, that policy was fair, yeah.
And in another example, one of the examples that you brought up, the example of whether or not we're going to be able to build a bridge without a vote of the entire state of Michigan, that went before the Supreme Court. In fact, two of the justices that voted to allow that to go on the ballot actually are running for Supreme Court now.
That's correct. Yep, that's right.
So these are just some of the ways when, I guess I call it boots on the ground. This is how some of the things that come through the Supreme Court affect us. One other real large example, and perhaps you're familiar with the case, is a case involving a corporation called MERS, Mortgage Electronic Registration Systems.
Yes, I know the case. Yeah.
And what that did is that validated thousands of what other states have called invalid foreclosures. And so our Supreme Court decided that an entity that in most states in the country has been disqualified from foreclosing on homes can foreclose on homes in Michigan.
Yeah, I don't know if it's still true, but I think the last I read, Michigan's decision in that case made us a complete outlier. Every other state that had decided it the other way. So that's a very important decision that the court's making that affects an awful lot of homeowners in distress.
I know that the Washington Supreme Court voted 9-0 against MERS, but there is one other state that allowed them, and that is Minnesota. And the reason why is because Minnesota wrote them into their statute. So that may be an example where the Supreme Court is hogtied. That's from my Iowa language. They can't do anything different because their statute says it, unless the law of equity or common law, invalidates that statute. But is it often the case in your study, and I know you study the Supreme Court, and not just Michigan Supreme Court, but other Supreme Courts, is it often the case that the precedents that have recently been set in Michigan are precedents that are counter to the precedents that have been set in other states?
So, the Michigan Supreme Court, you don't have to actually ask for my opinion on it, although I do like as a law teacher, I do study appellate decision making in my scholarship, and in my teaching, we actually what we're teaching from is appellate decisions, not just state Supreme Courts, but the U.S. Supreme Court. But you don't have to take my word for it. There's been some study of the Michigan Supreme Court's work. The University of Chicago did a study in 2008, and one of the factors it evaluated was the extent to which other Supreme Courts followed the decisions the Michigan Supreme Court makes, because it's some measure of to what extent its decisions are, credible decisions. And the Michigan Supreme Court rated either 49th or 50th along that measure. So it's not currently producing jurisprudence that's having a lot of that's taking a leadership role across the country.
So they're actually not in a leadership role. Whereas when my father was practicing law, he used to tell me that if they can't find a case in Iowa, they would look to the Supreme Court because there were great jurists there.
The Michigan Supreme Court, yeah, absolutely. The Michigan Supreme Court once was an incredibly storied state Supreme Court. It had a national reputation for being scholarly, having independence, and having integrity. And I think Michigan deserves that kind of Supreme Court again.
I agree with you, and let's hope that the voters restore that Supreme Court. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll be concluding our segment with Bridget McCormack, who is running for Michigan Supreme Court in 2012. We want you to learn more about her, so stay tuned. This is Brian Dailey. It's the Law Show on News Talk 760 WJR. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.